The New Level Cap podcast is a show about fun, friends, game design, and all things otherwise. Your hosts are Marco DeSantos and Brad Telton of Level 99 Games. I'm Chris Solis, your producer, and without further ado, please enjoy the show.
Podcast intro testing case number 1. Hello and welcome everyone to the New Level Cap. Okay, mistake. Podcast case number 2. Hello and welcome everyone. How do you guys feel about that? How do you feel about that intro?
I can't approve this intro. You're gonna have to take this back to development, Marco.
Okay, iterate. Let's iterate. Let's
iterate.
Yeah, let's iterate. Podcast number 3. Hello and welcome to this grand new episode of the Level Cap podcast featuring me, your host, Marco DeSantos, also known as the Mechanic Critic, and with me is my amazing co-host,
Brad Telton Jr.
And with us is a very, very special guest.
Hi, I'm John Brieger.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast, the New Level Cap podcast. We're so excited to have John with us today. Brad, how are you excited?
I'm excited in the normal way that people are excited, but I think that we should let our fans get excited by having John introduce himself to everyone here on the podcast. So, John, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, I guess to lead in, I'm excited in a very unusual way, and I'll leave that to the fans to figure out what that might be. I'm John Brieger. I work as a board game developer. So after a prototype is signed by a publisher or developed in-house by a publisher, they might bring a developer on to refine that prototype into a final product. And that include things like running playtesting programs, balancing and mechanical tweaks, or even changing the product to suit the audience. So looking at components, packaging, unique marketable angles to help the publisher fit that game to the audience the best. I've been part-time doing this about 2.5 years now, and it's been a little under a year full-time.
Okay, and are there any titles that our audience might recognize that have your fingerprints on them?
I work with Thunderworks Games, and they publish the Roll Player series, ROLL Player, and so I've worked on their standalone titles, Lock Up, A Role Player Tale, Cartographers, and currently I'm working on the new role player expansion, Fiends and Familiars. My clients and licensees also include people like B&B Games, Final Frontier Games, Tasty Minstrel Games, and a number of others.
Well, it's great to have you on the show with us.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
Well, since we're all excited in different kinds of ways, I think it's very important that we, pool together and try to understand what this excitement is all about. Because on this episode, we have a very special topic that makes use of John's particular set of skills in order to bring insight to you, our dear listener, viewer, watcher, feeler, smeller. Because our topic for this week is...
some of those things you can't do with a podcast.
I mean, it really depends. You could smell the podcast. It won't smell like anything, but you can.
Your synesthesia is showing, Marco.
I don't know. Do they make those kind of smell-o-vision type modules they make for movies for podcasts too?
This could be a new industry.
This should be a new gameplay mechanic that we talk about in a future episode, but this episode is what's important. And what's this episode about, Brad? Tell me, or else I will die.
Well, don't do that. Okay. All right. So this episode, we are talking about playtesting. And what is playtesting? This is the process that we use to play and test games in order to ensure quality before we go to publication. So it's an expensive endeavor to print a game. We want to make sure the game we print is good. So we invest a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of attention into doing testing to make sure that the game feels right.
Ooh, so you're telling me that our topic for this week is something our guest is really good at and probably does for work?
Obviously, it seems like maybe this topic was selected with that in mind.
Ooh.
Are you telling me you didn't just spin a roulette wheel of topics and this just happened to pop out? Because I am shocked.
Yeah, shocked. Yeah, it's as if we put effort and planning into any of these episodes. So
that's the new Level Cap podcast way.
That's the new part. There's planning. So there are many ways that we can playtest a game, and the steps and practices that we outline here aren't necessarily going to be the best or the perfect ones or the one that may be right for you and your company and your game and your group. These are just things that you should probably think about and things you should probably consider when trying to playtest. So this is by no means a playtester's guide to the galaxy of board games.
Yeah, and I think it's important that if you're not doing something that we mentioned, that doesn't mean the way you're doing it is wrong. It just means that maybe there's a different way you could be looking at your approach or asking questions to yourself about the process that you're going through.
Yeah, and it's important to point out on that note that the playtesting process is going to be different for different kinds of games and for different kinds of companies and based upon what your goals are. So if you are trying to make a certain kind of game, you might need to do things in your own way. But you might find that our way is cool too. So see what you think. And I'm sure that me and John both have very different ways of managing playtesting. So hash out all the differences and see where things lie.
All right. Are there different kinds of playtesting? Is there like only one kind? Like, do you categorize playtesting in specific ways or what? Both of you have way more experience than me, so I will defer to your godly grace.
Well, okay, I can't speak too much for other companies, but in our process, we have two steps to this. We have design and we have a development cycle. And then in the design cycle, that's where we decide about the core mechanics of the game. If the game is good, the feeling that we're going to capture and how we're going to put all that together in the game. And then in the development cycle, that is where we actually refine the balance and the gameplay. This is what you more traditionally understand as playtesting.
And I would agree with those as kind of broad categorizations, but within playtesting for design and playtesting for development, there's a lot of different methods that you can use as part of your playtesting, and each of those methods is going to be tied to, again, what your goal is, what you're trying to learn, and what kind of game you are testing and what kind of product you're developing.
Yeah. So, shocker, one blanket statement does not encompass the entire reality of the real world. Both of you, tell me, how the heck do you do this? How do you playtest? Usually, when we're on the show, we talk about game mechanics or design aspects, and we talk about how games utilize them. But I feel like in the process of playtesting, I think we should just talk about the actual processes and things that we consider when we playtest. So, how do you playtest? Let's start with our special guest because, guests first.
My background is in qualitative research. I'm a trained design researcher, and that's a very formal discipline of evaluating how customers use products and how they interact with experiences. And so I take a lot of my cues for board game playtesting from kind of established patterns that are used in qualitative research. And that includes a lot of things around research ethics, right? Who is eligible to participate in playtests? What kind of consent do they have to give to participate? It's important to me personally that playtesters are volunteers, right? You're not forcing your friends to sit down and playtest your game for the 80 millionth time. Playtesters need to feel free that they can stop at any time, and that's an important ethical boundary for me. Mm-hmm. In terms of how I playtest, there's kind of two major camps that my playtests fall into, and I'm going to use some research terms here. So the first is what we're going to call a convenient sample, right? So I go to my local game store or I go to a convention, and my playtesters are people who are there that are interested. Mm-hmm. So I'm pulling from a set of people out of convenience. The second we're going to maybe call a formal sample, and this is where I've established a playtesting pool. So I've gathered interest and I've funneled them maybe into an email list, maybe into a Facebook group, maybe into something else. And then I'm going to select specific groups to playtest out of that pool, depending on what my goals are. So that might be a random sample. It might be something like I need 4 groups who have never played any battling card game before ever, right? So I might have them fill out demographic questionnaires that ask about basic demographics, right? Age, ethnicity, gender, and as well as their experience with games, their experience with playtesting, things like that.
Mm-hmm. It seems like you've put a lot of thought into making sure that you get the right people to playtest the games and that they are prepared in the right ways to play the games. we try to involve everybody who wants to playtest in our playtesting program. So we have an open playtesting program, and you can just go on our website, sign up, play the games, and see what we have available to us. So we try to make it really open for people to get into. But we do have weekly events for playtesting, and we send out a newsletter, and we invite people to come and play at these specific times. And because we're really doing imbalance testing of intense competitive games like Exceed and BattleCon and Pixel Tactics, games like that, we need to have a large pool of testers, and we need to have a large pool of experienced testers who are very familiar with the game. So in order to get people together, we have this big pool, and we run these events for our testing, and we also offer incentives. For example, if you playtest Millennium Blades, which is coming out right now, you can get a free add-on after the Kickstarter, or you can get other cool stuff by playing some of our other games before they go to Kickstarter and becoming a part of the playtest team. Alternatively, we also offer organized play promos. So if you don't have a lot of people near you to play our games, this is a great way to get in some of those plays, get some cool promo cards, and meet other fans online. So it's a big part of our community effort is also our playtesting program.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is really important. If you are listening to this and you're thinking about either getting involved in a playtesting community or potentially running one for a game that you're working on, is having playtesters feel like they are part of the process is really important, because that's how you're going to get people who are really engaged through the whole time.
Yeah, and as part of that too, we think, so my belief at least is that the kind of people who playtest are the kind of people who are really interested in game design, maybe as a hobby, maybe academically, but certainly they're invested in game design. They don't just want to play a game. They want to really understand the nuts and bolts of how it works. And so one of the things that we're doing for our upcoming games is we're building design manuals. And this is, a short PDF, maybe a few thousand words, but it explains the different balancing mechanisms that are in play, the reason we made choices we made during game design, and how the games balance, and the kind of feel that the design team wants to achieve with the game. And giving our playtesters that information so that they can make informed comments about how the system they see in front of them is stacking up to those goals. So that's something we're starting. We don't know yet how successful it's going to be, but I believe, based on my belief about the players themselves that are doing this, that they will appreciate that kind of support.
Quite honestly, this has already worked a little bit, because even if we don't have those documents yet, for one of our playtests for Exceed, we actually had this document where Brad basically listed down, like, this is the fantasy that every single one of these characters should fulfill, and that has really informed a lot of the playtest sessions. And sometimes when a playtester plays a character and goes like, that doesn't fit the fantasy, we basically all collude together and go like, we should probably change this character, and we come up with a new version that we all feel fits the fantasy more. That tends to be a very cool thing that makes all of the players feel like they're heavily engaged in the process, specifically because they get to quote-unquote modify the characters themselves, right? It's quite interesting to see that happen.
It's something that we get because we have our design and development teams in-house, but I'm curious how it is for you, John. Do you get that kind of support from your design teams, or do you endeavor to create something like that, or how do you understand the process from design to development?
So for me, I work as a freelance contractor, right? So typically at the outset of a development project, I'm going to have a long call with the original designer of the game, where we're going to talk through the vision of the project and what they feel is really important from an experience perspective or from an emotional perspective. Let's say it's really important that you feel like you're swinging a big sword around in this game, and that's something the designer communicates to me. But my client is ultimately the publisher of the game, and so I'm also having conversations with the publisher separately from the designer about what they view as the appeal to audience, what they view as the appeal to consumers. And then when I take the game to playtesting meetups, usually, again, most of what I do is that convenient sample, right? I'm going to, my local library game day and showing it to real consumers or similar. I'm looking to see if the game that's been turned in from the designer is achieving those goals. What are the parts of that game that are delivering on those goals the best? And then where can I be streamlining to focus the game on the core experience. So at the same time, I'm looking for changes to things like balance and mechanical tweaks to help the game flow better. I'm also looking for what are the elements of the game that are the most fun and trying to kind of turn those up to 11. And I think it's sometimes a mistake to look at the development process as only about balancing, right? Because you're still trying to figure out how to make the product the best possible it can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to do that at every stage of the game to try and elevate your product.
Yeah, because ultimately, a game's supposed to be fun, right? I don't care if your game's balanced if it's not fun, right?
Well, games not just has to be fun, but it has to deliver on the promises that you made on the box or on the Kickstarter or when you sold the game. So that's not like if you deliver a game and it's fun, but it's not the kind of fun that you promised, then it's not going to fly.
That's fair. Like, imagine if we promised BattleCon and then we gave people a random card game, like with random elements, when we advertised that it wasn't, right? It's just not correct.
Yeah, you have to. So I think that that's a great point that John has. Though you have to be viewing everything through the filter of the of the fantasy the game's supposed to fulfill.
Yeah, because ultimately that's important. So I firmly believe that we've said some good points about how we do playtesting, but it's very important to help our listeners improve their playtesting. Maybe they don't know where to start. Maybe they don't know what to do. So we're going to take a short break, and after it, we're going to discuss how you can do good playtesting. So listen to this small ad for Millennium Blades Collusion or anything else, and we'll be back after the break. Everyone say goodbye and break time.
If you tell them what the ad is and before they listen to the ad, what's the point of the ad even? You just did the ad yourself right here on
Double
air.
exposure.
Double exposure, Brad. You know, the more they listen to it, the more indoctrinated they'll be into our cult of games.
It's a culture, not a cult, Marco.
Wait, doesn't cult mean culture?
I'm sure they're derivative, actually. But let's not dwell too much on that.
All right. Say goodbye break, guys.
Millennium Blades Collusion is on its final days on Kickstarter. Discover 400 new cards, NPCs, team play, and an epic storage solution to store it all. Check out the Kickstarter link in the description.
Welcome back from the break. We've saved you from the brink of advertisement and capitalism so that you can come back.
The brink of the break?
The brink of the break. John, what did you do during the break that was so important?
Yeah, so I have a long skincare ritual. So it was a mixture of a kind of mud clay bath and like a little bit of a face mask. It was very rejuvenating.
I see. So it was less of a break and more of like a spa 5 minutes for you.
Definitely. I feel very refreshed and ready to tackle our second section.
All right. So in this second section, we're going to be talking about what makes for good playtesting. And, the personal Marco touch has been like sprinkled all over this part.
The four shuns of playtesting?
Yeah, the 4 shuns of playtesting. I've decided to give us 4 distinct points, and I've decided to make all of them rhyme so that it's easy to remember for our listeners. And
but it sounds like the 4 shuns of playtesting, like we're shunning people out of playtesting when you say it that way.
The 4 chins of playtesting, right? Like it's good fortune.
Yeah. I like that. The 4 shuns.
Onward into the to infinity and beyond, Marco.
All right, to infinity and beyond. Let's start with the
There's
first.
There's your Kingdom Hearts reference.
Oh my god! You know what? I bet nobody ever loved you.
Ouch! Ouch! Zing!
No, that was a Kingdom Hearts reference too.
Oh, that was a Kingdom Hearts reference?
Yeah, there's like that scene where Woody from Toy Story meets Xehanort or Xemnas or whatever, and literally Woody savagely just points to Xemnas and goes, I bet no one's ever loved you.
Oh, man.
I mean, honestly, you could just be making up Kingdom Hearts scenes. Like, do you remember when this character met that character? And they said this ridiculous thing?
That's fair. I could say something like, hey, remember that time Goofy got a gun? I mean, like, I'm pretty sure that actually happened in Kingdom Hearts at some point, but like...
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Let's start with the first shun. All right. Invitation. Basically, this shun is all about understanding who your game is for, and therefore, who should be playtesting your game. Or at least, the people you have to keep in mind while playtesting. So what's very important about this? How do we go about this? So on the level 99 game standpoint, we kind of went over this already. We kind of have a huge pool of testers, and we kind of like have some basic demographics about them, like their age and their location, as well as their...
And I think that that's an advantage when you have a mature game, that you can pull playtesters from the player pool.
Yeah, exactly.
Because BattleCon and Exceed have been around so long, our playtesters are people who have played in our tournaments, who have followed the development for years now, who really intimately understand the game. That's not something that you can do when you're building games, designer games from scratch. So I'm curious to see what John has to say about it. How do you find and recruit playtesters?
Yeah, and the thing is, it is different for different genres of game, right? I'd put BattleCon in kind of the mastery genre of game, right? Part of the core fun of the game is that people who are going to get into it are going to get really into it and really explore all the edges of it. And a majority of hobby games that get released probably don't fit into that category. And so when I'm recruiting playtesters, I might look for people who have never played a similar game, right? In the case of Cartographers, which is a game I just finished development on where you are fantasy map makers, it fits into a genre of games called roll and write games. So there's a central pool. Everyone is going to look at something and write down a similar thing on their sheet. In this case, they're going to draw a shape into their map. And so when I was recruiting playtesters, I looked for not just people who were very experienced in the genre of game, but also people who had never played one at all, because there's a good chance for a lot of people who would be purchasing this game at retail, this would be their first exposure into that genre of game.
Yeah, we experienced something very similar when we had to playtest for Street Fighter Exceed, which is out now, because that's kind of the set that we were like, people who've never played Exceed are probably going to buy this. So we had to kind of also consider that part of the market, right? Like where we had to go, yeah, Exceed is a mastery kind of game, and it's important that you get good, but at the same time, like, you have to understand that characters have to be comprehensible enough that even a new player can play them. Because if you create an Exceed Street Fighter character like Ryu, and then suddenly, like, this character is incomprehensibly hard to use unless you have 5,000 games, then, like, what's the point, right?
Well, I think that another relevant example from us would be Imperial Spells and Steam, which was our railway game. Mm-hmm. And we had to... It was a little more difficult to find players for that, because our audience is not primarily a Euro rail building audience. And so when we looked at our player pool, we found a lot of players who were not as enthusiastic to do the kind of heavy development that you need to do to balance a game like that. And we did find them, but we mostly found them through making that playtesting offering on our Kickstarter project. And that brought in a lot of people that were already fans of the genre because they were interested in the concept that we had on Kickstarter, but they brought in kind of that unique knowledge that we needed to help the game develop.
And on my side, it's less important that my playtesting sample perfectly resembles the market, right? I have 10% colorblind players, so 10% of my playtesters are colorblind. That's less important than making sure that I cover all of the available segments, because I'd rather kind of over-include to make the game as accessible as possible to people than under-include because it's a really low percentage of players.
It's interesting that you do that at the design phase, because we usually leave that side of things to our creative team to manage. So when our graphic designer is doing the boards, for example, they try to make sure that we're covering for colorblind players and that sort of thing, rather than making the game first and then testing it with colorblind players. We test the game and then make sure that it's colorblind accessible after the fact.
And for me, I would put most of that in the development window. Right? It's after the initial game concept is set, but now we're looking at what is the experience of the product. And so for me, a lot of kind of legibility and interface and ease of use will start coming in under the development cycle, where we're trying to make sure that the game is as clear and kind of communicative of the design intent as possible.
Okay, so we talked about who is playtesting, but let's talk about how they should playtest. So the second shun is direction. Hey! So playtesting and playing the game with your friends or with your testers, willy-nilly every week, that's okay. A-okay. but it may not give you the results you want, and it may not be the most efficient way to test. So it's very good to give your players direction, all in all, meaning that you just give them specific things to look for or test for, because nothing is worse than playtesters not knowing what they should even be looking for. So it smoothens playtesting out if you have a general structure and go like, oh, for this week we're going to be checking this specific aspect of the game, so when you play, keep it in mind, or do things that allow you to make use of that space and see whether or not it's good. So in our playtesting, for example, for Millennium Blades Collusion, we do some stuff like we bend the rules a little bit so that we can include cards that usually don't get used as often due to the fact that they are limited resources in the game. So we kind of break the game so that the cards become way more accessible, even if in the actual game they won't be played that way, because we need to test the cards and see whether or not they function well. So there's stuff like that, you know?
So this kind of focused playtesting where we almost create a like test rule set that is optimized to target specific points in testing.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
So we talked a little bit about kind of setting up your overall test program structure. And so I think kind of the direction and the framing that you put around an individual test session is going to be what varies the most for me from game to game. So similar, I've done things like what you were saying, developing a test rule set, especially for longer games. So I might develop a set of mid-game positions where players essentially start the game halfway through, so I can test very specific combinations, right? So what happens if every player starts with, a charcoal furnace and 10 charcoal, right? And I'm now going to test, how good is the charcoal strategy in my fictional game that's all about barbecues, I guess. So sometimes it's things like that. Sometimes it's looking at testing specific elements of your game's experience. So maybe you're going to tell players to test a particular character or faction. You might be telling them to try a particular strategy in a game that has multiple paths to victory. So, this game, I really want you to focus only on filling in all of your, river patterns in your map, right? And make sure that you're going for maximum river points. And can you win the game by only focusing on the river and ignoring all the other types of terrain? Who knows? They definitely bias the outcome of a test, right? I'm not going to get a real game's data out of a game where I told two of the four players to get maximum river points. But what I am going to do is look very hard at if focusing on one specific element breaks the game in some way.
Yeah.
And how does this, when you talk about like giving people a very directed test, it sounds like these are the players that you have specifically selected. This is your selection group and not your casual group, or it's a casual group that is playing with you often because they would understand the game. They would have to understand the game to some extent to try and maximize these strategies. Or is that not the case?
You can build some of these directions into the structure of your playtesting program. So you might make print and play files available that only allow them to play specific endgame objectives or specific characters, right? So they don't know on their side that you're telling them to test that specific content, but because your print and play only includes that content, you're going to have a huge weight of feedback on it. So you can mess with the structure of your playtesting program to kind of hide some of that direction from the players.
I think there's one more thing that we haven't talked about, which is the importance of having direction. I think there's one more point to this, and that is because you don't always go to a game, or you don't have to come to a playtest with direction. You could just say, test the game, tell me your thoughts. And that's what I feel a lot of developers do. And so I'd like to hear from John, do you think that it is important to always have direction? Or is it okay to just throw a game out there and let the playtesters be honest about whatever they feel at the end?
So I don't know that it's always important for the players to feel like they have direction. But as the moderator or facilitator of the playtests, I think it's important that you have an internal goal, right? You're looking to evaluate some specific question about your game. So in tests where I'm not giving players specific direction, I still might have internal goals where I'm saying, I want to evaluate the first game experience, or I want to see how this system combos into this system. And I might not tell players that that's what I'm looking for, but I think it's very important as a developer or as a designer to be asking yourself questions and having a direction for yourself in every playtest iteration.
That's really great. Yeah. I would wholeheartedly agree with that.
So let's direct the second half of the podcast back and veer into our 4 shuns. The third shun is reception. Listen to your playtesters very well, but listen to them with a grain of salt. Not every piece of feedback is useful on the surface level. You have to understand when somebody goes like, oh, this character is broken and OP, it might necessarily mean that the character is OP, but it could also mean that the character's counter strategies are simply not clear enough for the person to utilize those strategies against that character.
There's actually there's a good story about this I read from Ignacy Trzewiczek, who did Neuroshima Hex, and the designer Michael Orkaz sent him a new faction, Steel Police, and they were playing this in the office, and it just dominated. Nobody could stop Steel Police for ages and ages and ages, and finally Ignacy came back and he's like, "Look, Michael, we have to fix this because these guys are not beatable." And the designer shot back. He's like, "You just don't know how to play against them." And he eventually came into the office and he just knocked down every single person in the office with every other faction that you could think of, easily beating this new faction because he, as the designer, understood all the weaknesses about them. But they did make changes because it was not clear to the players how to beat them.
Yeah, and that's something that really is going to depend on the type of game you're producing. Again, when you talk about a mastery game where players are going to spend time to try to explore those counter strategies, you can include things with a higher barrier of entry, let's say. Whereas in a lot of more kind of mass market board games or even more casual hobby board games, what we're looking for sometimes is actually less the game being mathematically balanced, but more the perception of balance and fairness on the first couple plays, so that players are learning that the curve for learning strategies is similar for all the different roles at the same time.
Playtesters will give feedback, and feedback that you get is often going to be specific feelings about a game, which are not useful on their own, but I think, like John was saying, they're useful in aggregate. It's about figuring out what everybody is saying together, and then determining the signal that's inside that noise and isolating it.
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that a lot of people can point towards one thing and go, this thing is the problem. But just because they said that's the problem doesn't mean it's actually the problem, It might just be a symptom of the overlying problem. For example, when we were testing an Exceed character, who I shall not name, we ended up going like, oh, this thing is the problem, this thing is the problem, this thing is the problem. And 7 different people said different things were problems. But in the end, the actual problem was just this one thing that fed into all those other 7 things. So it was very important that one thing changed, and then suddenly things felt better,
Yeah, and when I'm moderating a playtest in person, I'm always looking to try to get at those root causes, right? So if a player gives me a specific, maybe let's say a design suggestion, right? I'm always going to try to ask a follow-up question that centers on their play experience, right? Something like, did it feel like insert emotion here? And get back at what they're feeling that causes them to make the suggestion, because then I can interpret all of those, as Brad said, in aggregate, right? I can bubble up all of those feelings to look at, can I make one tweak that's going to solve lots of design issues all at once?
And I think that's an important point that you make here, that when you're the developer, you're not looking for really suggestions from the audience, and it's good to get suggestions, but really you are looking for the feelings that lead to the suggestions, because presumably you understand the game well enough that you can correct those problems. So forcing people to talk about their feelings and not about the fixes is an important part of leading that discussion.
And let's now move on to our final shun, the 4th shun. 4th shun! Iteration. What kind of playtesting does not iterate? It's not enough that you play one game and make one change. You have to keep doing it. That's the burden that playtesting puts upon us. You have to make sure it is tested rigorously. And one thing I want to make a point of here is that when you iterate, the changes need not always be giant version changes. Oh, where we added this new mechanic, or we took out this thing, or we added this alternate mode of play. Sometimes a simple small change, like we talked about in reception, can easily cascade into a giant flowering bloom explosion of changes. So whether or not it's like a simple numbers change, or maybe you just simply tweak the timing of a specific mechanic, it can easily change the entire experience. So sometimes iteration is great, but it need not always be a giant sweeping version change.
This is certainly my vice, because when I'm designing, I like to just change game systems. If it's not working, I'm just like, oh, we'll just pull it out and we'll put in a different combat system. And that's not the best way to do design, and I'm working to curb my own impulses in that area.
Well, so for me, it's a lot about where you are in the life cycle of the game, right? So when I'm really early on my own designs, I'm going to make big sweeping changes all the time because I'm just going to be evaluating the experience as a whole and trying to figure out where the core fun of the design is still. When it's late in the development process, right, and I'm I have a game that's due back to the publisher in 6 weeks, I'm probably not going to make those big sweeping changes, partly because I may not have time to test them as rigorously as I try to ensure, but partly because the vision of the product is a lot more crystallized. So I don't want to change the core of the value that the game is going to provide so late in the product's life cycle.
Yeah, it could be very dangerous ground to suddenly make big sweeping changes while the deadline's creeping up.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big advantages of having that kind of designer manual that we talked about earlier, because your players and your developers can understand this is what we're really going for, and they can filter their suggestions into that. They understand what their target is.
Yeah, and it isn't to say that big sweeping changes don't happen. I definitely recently received a development project where I played the game. I actually played it with Brad, and we felt like it wasn't delivering on the promise and the vision. And so I went back to the publisher and proposed very, very radical changes from the original design. But I laid out a very solid case for them that was kind of backed up with quotes from playtesters about their real experiences. And the publisher approved really, really radical changes, even though this game had already been through, about a year of time with the original designer.
It happens.
These points, the 4 shuns that we have listed here, are not ironclad rules, right? They're more like guidelines. And if you have to break them for the good of your game, if you firmly believe in your heart of hearts, the Kingdom Hearts, that it will make your game better if you break these shuns, then you probably should, especially if you know the game enough and you know your testers enough, right?
The most important thing is to make something remarkable and that delivers on the promise that you made. And so, no matter what else you have to do, that's what you have to do.
All right. So, as much as I would love to keep chatting with both of you, since you are both such amazing, amazing people, we have to deliver on the promise that this podcast ends.
Well, that was pretty abrupt.
Do we just fade to black? We just cut it off right there?
No, we're not doing this, guys. All right, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the New Level Cap podcast. And I hope that you like this episode. If you liked it, please tell us in the comment section down below. Give us a like, give us a follow, and follow us on all podcasting apps, including Google Play, Apple Music, and Spotify. Thank you so much for listening. I have been Marco DeSantos. With me has been my wondrous co-host,
Brad Talton. Thank you again for joining us. And with us, our very, very special guest,
John Brieger. It's been a pleasure being on. You can find me on Twitter at @DasBrieger, DasBrieger, and a link to that will be in the show notes. And if you're interested in checking out some fantasy map making in Cartographers, a role-player tale, there will be a link in the show notes to the Thunderworks Games website where it's available for pre-order now.
It sounds interesting to me. I want to be a magic map maker.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And as always, happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
The New Level Cap podcast is produced by Level 99 Games. Join us next Wednesday for more design talk and shenanigans. Thank you for listening.